Dear Esther, dear family, friends and colleagues, on behalf of the rector, Professor Luc Zoete, I would like to welcome you at this important event. Today, Professor Esther Versluis will present her inaugural lecture focusing on the European regulatory state at risk, the EU as a regulator of complex policy problems. Professor Versluis holds a special chair in European regulatory governance at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University. Professor Versluis, the floor is to you.
Dear family, friends and colleagues. Sometimes the European Union decides about the color and the curves of bananas. Sometimes the EU has to decide about the handling of large streams of refugees. Some policy problems simply are more complex than others. With the acceptance of this chair in European regulatory governance, I intend to spend the upcoming years analyzing the European Union as a regulator of complex policy problems. In recent years, we have witnessed problems in very diverse policy fields and at all kinds of levels. Think of the mad cow disease, the genetically modified maize, swine flu, the Eurozone crisis, and international terrorism. Such problems are increasingly transboundary. The reason for this is that modern societies are more and more interconnected, and geographical borders and policy boundaries become less and less relevant. There is no such thing as a Dutch environmental problem. Problems related to the environment in the Netherlands are transboundary in the sense that they are interconnected with related problems in neighboring European countries. And they are interconnected with problems related to other policy sectors. Think, for example, of the economy, the impact of the growing consumption patterns. Or think of trade, the impact of increasing global trade on the environment. As a result, risks and uncertainties easily spread over very diverse policy and country borders. Such transboundary policy problems are hard to manage because it is very often unclear who is responsible for them. Particularly in the European Union, no single actor, public or private, could solve complex policy problems alone. This is the case because the European Union is an international organization in which we witness a diversity in political cultures and regulatory frameworks. Put more generally, in an international organization such as the EU, where different member states are affected by different circumstances and where different political, social, and economic systems are brought together, regulation is often complex and challenging. Let's take the ongoing refugee crisis as an example. This problem, by definition, is transboundary, crossing both national and policy borders. From an economic perspective, the refugee crisis is mainly a cost-benefit problem. What is the economic impact of increasing immigration numbers on the national economy? Cultural scientists will stress the impact of religious and cultural fault lines on the attitude and behavior of both immigrants as well as the European civil society. From an international relations perspective, the problem lies much more in the disturbed balance of power between different regions in the world and the nature of the conflict in Syria impacting on immigration flows and terrorist activity. In sum, different policy perspectives highlight different parts of the wider problem. The same can be said for different country perspectives. Nobody will counter the argument that the refugee problem does not play out the same in Turkey, Greece, or Scandinavia. And thus, the way the refugee crisis is defined and how this needs to be solved will be different for these different countries. Yet, at the same time, it is very obvious that no country can solve this problem alone, and European action is needed. The core question that the existence of such complex policy problems brings along is the question how to handle such problems. In the years to come, I intend to concentrate on precisely this. How does the EU regulate complex policy problems? Why do I concentrate on the regulation of complex policy problems? The EU is a regulatory state. Its core approach to policy problems is regulation. But what is regulation? For right-wing parties, regulation is a dirty word representing the hand of authoritarian governments. While for left-wing Democrats, it can refer to a tool to control eager capitalists. For legal scholars, it refers to legal instruments. While for sociologists, it can also include forms of social control. To make it even more complex, in the European Union, one of the binding legal instruments is a regulation. This is not what I refer to when I talk about regulation. I follow a broader definition, referring to everything governments do to establish, monitor, and control norms. My aim is to provide a better understanding of how the EU handles complex policy problems via regulation. And here we come to the core. What are complex policy problems, and how can we analyze them? In the most general understanding of the term, a policy problem is something that is undesirable for everybody, both citizens and policymakers. Some policy problems may be considered to be simple, others more complex. What is complexity then in this context? There is no single answer to this question, as different disciplines research the same topic, yet use different terminology. Public policy scholars talk about wicked problems, social scientists discuss the regulation of crisis, and science and technology studies concentrates on risks. In the end, discussing this issue using a variation of concepts, in principle, these different schools address the same topic: how to deal with complex policy problems. Let's briefly discuss what main lessons we can learn from these different disciplinary traditions in their analysis of this specific topic. I will start with complex policy problems as wicked problems. From founding fathers Rittel and Weber, we learned that there are simple problems and wicked problems. Simple or tame problems are those where problem definition and solution to the problem are understood. Simple problems are easy to define. Information needed to solve the problem is available, and there is consensus on both the problem and the solutions. For example, the regulation of the color and the curves of bananas that I mentioned earlier is a simple problem. Wicked problems are those where both the nature of the problem and the solution are uncertain and controversial. In other words, we don't know what the problem is, we don't know how to solve this, and thus wicked problems cannot be objectively defined, nor are there any objectively valid solutions. This is in the eye of the beholder. There will always be variation in judgment about wicked problems. And this variation lies in personal interests and different worldviews. Wicked problems can thus never be definitely solved. Again, take the refugee crisis as an example. It is crystal clear that this problem can never be objectively defined, nor are there any objectively valid solutions. This is indeed in the eye of the beholder. Let's now turn to complex problems as risk problems. We live in a risk society where growing uncertainties have to be accepted because they can only be managed and never be completely eliminated. Increasing globalization, as well as increasing complexity of our technologies, influence the levels of ambiguity and uncertainty. The higher the levels of ambiguity and uncertainty, the more difficult it becomes for policymakers to define their preferences, and the more dependent they become on experts and scientific advice. But all such advice is embedded in prior socially derived assumptions, and it is thus crucial to realize that there is no knowledge without interests. Risks are mental constructions. They originate in the human mind, as Ren states. Thus, risk perceptions vary amongst individuals. The extent to which people are afraid of risks or are willing to take risks is influenced by the amount of knowledge about the risk at hand, also by the personality, the economic situation, the political position, and the cultural background or worldview. It is thus not surprising that how societies handle risks very much relates to institutional, procedural, social, and cultural dimensions. Regulating risks is complex, particularly in contexts such as the European Union, where there is a wide variety in political cultures, cultural frameworks, and standards in risk assessment. Linking this to the example of the refugee crisis, we clearly see that the risk of increasing refugee numbers are differently defined by Turkey than by Sweden. Let's turn from risks to crisis. A crisis is never objectively given, and part of it is always socially constructed. It can be in the interest of certain actors to label something as a crisis. Analyzing crisis implies that we analyze the framing, the language used. Crises are basically framing contests to interpret events, their causes, and the potential way forward. It is thus no coincidence that I selected a newspaper picture to illustrate this particular body of the literature. An important component of the crisis literature is to focus on crisis or disaster management. How do organizations cope with and manage crisis? What we learn from the various case studies is the problematic fragmentation of authority and thus a lack of clear ownership. Who feels responsible, feels to have sufficient legitimacy base for tackling the crisis at hand? Crisis leads to a politics of urgency, where it is easier to push for certain decisions as the sense of urgency leads to more readiness for change. Just as the wicked problem literature teaches us that such problems cannot be solved, and the risk literature informs us that many risks are uncertain and unknown, the crisis literature discusses that crisis prevention is essentially impossible. Rather than trying to prevent crisis, organizations should become resilient and learn to cope with unanticipated dangers and learn to bounce back. What do we learn from this wide body of literature on wicked problems, risks, and crisis? Whatever approach one puts center stage, one thing becomes very clear. There is no such thing as an objectively identified policy problem. This is in the eye of the beholder, and it is embedded in social, cultural, normative, and administrative contexts. And thus, framing is of crucial importance. How stakeholders involved in the game frame the problem and the potential solutions is key. Every perspective about the nature of a problem implies a preferred solution. Thus, those in control of framing the policy problems determine the type of potential solutions that are perceived as most reliable. Or, to put it more bluntly, defining the policy problem is an exercise in power. Particularly in the EU, the definition, perception, and foreseen impact of any given policy problem will never be exactly the same for all 28 member states. Let's return to this example of the refugee problem. How this complex policy problem is framed in the different parts of the European Union is completely different. The definition of the problem in Greece is a different one compared to how the problem is identified in the United Kingdom. It is not possible to provide an objective description of the refugee problem. In fact, the term refugee itself as such is contested by alternatives like economic migrants. Nor is there a clear and simply identifiable solution readily available, partly because the relevant evidence needed to understand the problem can never be complete. We have no way of knowing exactly what the impact of the continuous streams of refugees is on the societal and economic situations in these different member states. Nor will we ever have a full understanding of the precise nature of the problems in Syria. A complicating factor is that the problem also constantly changes. With every new event happening, think of the problematic situation in Cologne on New Year's Eve, the problem, and thus also its potential solutions, change. How does the fact that complex policy problems cannot be objectively defined, solutions cannot be provided, evidence can never be complete, and thus they can never be solved, only managed, how does this impact the capability of the European Union to deal with such complex policy problems? How can the EU, with its ever-limited resources and contested legitimacy base, regulate a situation in which there is no consensus on the problem at hand, nor on the potential solutions, and of which we know upfront that the problem can actually never be solved? Within the EU, the current response to this growing complexity shows an increasing reliance on European-level agencies. Agencies are a popular form of regulatory governance since the 1990s, and not only in the EU. Agencyfication is a common trend in most advanced industrial democracies. This strategy is rooted in the belief that agencies, through independent expertise and apolitical high-quality evaluations, will lead to better decisions, more efficiency, and increased accountability. Agencies such as the European Chemicals Agency, the European Food Safety Authority, and the European Medicines Agency have an explicit role in risk assessment. This illustrates that independent agencies are expected to provide better technical expertise and are capable of making more credible policy decisions. Faith in knowledge and expertise have always been important justifications for the delegation of power to regulators such as agencies. And here we come to the role of knowledge and expertise in the regulation of complex policy problems. Following Lyotard, who decides what knowledge is, and who knows what needs to be decided? The increasing reliance on agencies and other types of networks and expert groups indicates a reliance on evidence-based policymaking. Becoming a popular notion in the late 1990s, particularly advocated by the first Blair government, the current better regulation agenda of the EU is still full of evidence-based thinking. This type of policymaking assumes that when you increase the quantity and quality of knowledge and information used in the formulation of policy, policymaking becomes more technical and thus more amenable to rational decision-making. In other words, it becomes less wicked. The goal of evidence-based policymaking is to use verifiable research results to inform policymaking. It attempts to make policy problems appear more technical and less social and political. Evidence-based policymaking indicates a strong reliance on experts and expertise in the policy process. But what we have just learned from these different conceptualizations of complex policy problems is the understanding that we lack knowledge about the specific problem at hand, and also about the potential solutions to solve them. In order to regulate in a situation with such a knowledge deficit, the obvious reaction of political actors involved in the game is to increase our knowledge and thus involve experts and scientific advice. What are the implications of a policy process that almost automatically turns to science and expertise in the face of uncertainty? Critics of evidence-based policy argue that evidence is rarely objective and in principle full of values. If you follow Schön in his understanding of policymaking as a messy swamp, the only thing evidence-based policymaking can do is to map the mess. What's more, evidence-based policymaking has the danger of experts resorting to ghostwriting, producing evidence in favor of the preferred policy solution, or silencing evidence, arguing against the preferred policy solution. In other words, experts tend to give the scientific advice that they know to be politically acceptable. In sum, we should be careful not to blindly rely on expert advice as the solution to the problem of regulating complexity. This again became clear 2 weeks ago when Commissioner Timmermans claimed that the figures by Frontex showed that 60% of the refugees are economic migrants, while UNHCR spoke of 88% of the refugees coming from war zones. Let's now finally turn to the most interesting part of this lecture. What do we make of all of this? What can we learn from these different perspectives on complex policy problems and the way the EU is currently responding to them? I would like to start by stressing the impact of limited human capacity, bounded rationality, and perceptions. We thus know that how we think about complex policy problems is socially constructed and varies in different societal contexts. Perceptions and responses to complexity can only be understood against the background of people's embeddedness in a socio-cultural background. Douglas and Wildavsky have argued that social and cultural processes determine which risks society fear and which risks they ignore. How people perceive complex policy problems is thus influenced by the relevant context, and this in turn influences behavior. This is linked to the notion of bounded rationality, as put forward by Simon. Humans only have so much capacity to process information and estimate probabilities. Thus, emotions and worldviews help us to make sense of the complex, uncertain, and sometimes dangerous world. The impact of bounded rationality can be further illustrated by how people look at risks. We know from cognitive social psychology that initial perceptions about risks structure the way new evidence about these risks is interpreted. New evidence will particularly be perceived as reliable when it is in line with one's own initial beliefs. We also know that men tend to judge risks as smaller than women. White male consider risks as smaller than non-white male. And better educated, high income and politically conservative white male belong to the group with the lowest risk perception. Jeroen, you must live an easy life without any fears. But seriously, let's illustrate this again with the example of the refugee crisis. Where you live, your cultural and religious background, what political affiliation you have, your own economic situation, this all influences how you initially think about refugees. And this in turn obviously influences how you think about the current refugee crisis. If you have an initial belief that refugees are welcome, you will be likely to defend refugees when confronted with new evidence, such as the recent situation in Cologne. Someone with an initial negative belief will respond differently and perceive this news differently. Just as much as individuals are bounded in their rationality, so are organizations and governments. Just as individuals, organizations face considerable information processing and decision-making challenges, and they generally tend to avoid risks. This also influences that organizations tend to confirm rather than challenge existing ways of doing things. There is a natural tendency to decomplexification along the lines of the known. In sum, bounded rationality in organizations stands in the way of creativity and causes a confirmation bias and ensures that organizations follow the route well known. To recap, complex policy problems cannot be objectively defined, nor definitely solved. And in order to be able to address them, we have to be able to accept and work with the notion that science and expertise is never complete nor objective, and that people deciding about complex policy issues will be influenced by their own limited capacity and perceptions. Is all hope lost then? Or can we define specific characteristics that might influence or might help in tackling complex policy problems? Let's discuss participation, leadership, and flexibility and learning. The most widespread response by governments nowadays is to resort to some form of collaborative or networked management. This is also reflected in the EU. Already since the Laken Declaration of 2001, the call for more participation is widespread within the EU, and we currently still witness this within the current better regulation agenda. Widening participation is thought to improve the quality of regulation, better serve the public interest, and improve public awareness. Based on the analysis of participative risk regulation in the case of BSE in sheep in the United Kingdom, Rothstein concludes that we need to be careful in expecting too much of opening up the policy process. Participation as such is an insufficient criterion. Its success depends on who participates, who they represent, power balances between the participants, as well as the ability of the participants to handle complex and uncertain information. One thing is clear. Openness as such does not necessarily produce more robust policy outcomes than closed processes. Particularly in the context of the EU, deliberative problem solving appears only effective when politicization is low. And this is, of course, very unlikely in the case of complex policy problems. Why then bother with arranging participation? The reason why it is relevant is the following. It is argued that more cooperation between stakeholders is likely to lead to a common understanding of the problem at hand, and thus it is more likely that solutions are accepted and agreed upon. More collaboration increases the probability that parties will feel comfortable about revealing information that might make them vulnerable. An environment of trust is important here. It does seem that what deliberation and participation can bring is not so much a better policy outcome, but rather potentially acceptance about the solution chosen. As Conklin states, and I quote, "You don't so much solve a wicked problem as you help stakeholders negotiate shared understanding and shared meaning about a problem and its potential solutions." End of quote. As governments need to make tragic choices, that is, solutions for complex policy problems will always simultaneously have advantages in some areas and disadvantages in other areas, governments better ensure that they are on a good footing with all participants in the game in order to ensure acceptance. Every scholar writing about the vices and virtues of participation also discusses leadership. Listen carefully, Sophie. Maybe you'll learn something for this new job you have. There is a fine line between where political leaders need to position themselves, as authoritative leaders or participatory team players. The traditional understanding is that a good leader needs to be able to frame a vision for the organization and to make sure that others in the organization follow that vision by inspiring them to do so. This, however, becomes problematic in the case of complex policy problems. In such cases, the leader should focus less on a vision. How can he or she, in instances where the problem is not known, nor are the solutions? But the leader should rather engage in the mobilization of adaptive work. Such leaders should go beyond the traditional notion of top-down direction and lead stakeholders in undertaking themselves how to deal with the problem. This requires more a form of shared leadership, in which the role of the leader is to challenge and assist stakeholders to understand the difficult choices that they have to make and to deliberate about ways forward. Next to the leadership participation nexus, let's discuss the need for flexibility and for learning. Dealing with complex policy problems requires flexibility and new ways of thinking and the necessity to be able to switch between both problem definition and solution. Phrased differently, organizations need adaptive capacity in order to be able to cope with complexity. Following March, the adaptive capacity of organizations rests on how they deal with the tension between exploration and exploitation. Here, exploration relates to terms such as search, risk-taking, experimentation, play, flexibility, and innovation. Exploitation resorts to production, efficiency, selection, implementation, and execution. Particularly the first, exploration, is required when managing complex policy issues. But when looking at the European Union, it seems to rest more on those keywords associated with exploitation than those describing exploration. In order to be able to become a better manager of complex policy problems, it requires the EU to work on its flexibility and learning capacity. In order to control the messy swamp, in Schön's terminology, governments need to act as a facilitator of society's learning. Governments should not act as problem solver. Remember, the problems cannot be adequately solved, but should rather facilitate private and public learning. So now we finally know how we should have managed the reaccreditation process. But seriously, I do not claim that I have the definitive answer to the question what the EU should do to regulate complex policy problems. The careful listener realizes that this is not possible. There is no such thing as a golden mix or a golden approach, as every complex policy problem is unique. Complex policy problems are decision problems, requiring judgment, evaluation, requiring a choice amongst alternatives, although there are no right or wrong solutions. As such, regulating complex policy problems, per definition, touches upon a moral dimension. By ignoring all of this, regulators run the risk of false assurance. Many of the problems related to regulating complexity are blown up at the European level. In order to regulate complex policy issues in the EU, we need to, first of all, accept the limits to expertise and scientific certainty. Secondly, accept the existence of 28 different contextual situations. And thirdly, accept that not all member states will always comply with all solutions found. Regulation is still too often assuming all of this, relying on expertise to solve the problem, assuming that one size fits all, and relying too much on a situation of full compliance. Any regulatory answer to complex policy problems should reflect these three issues. What does this imply? I would say that this implies more flexibility in the regulatory solutions found. Let go of the idea that the same solutions work in all cases. Heath and Alford already argued for a more pragmatic approach in which the type of response is tailored to the type of wickedness the problem seems to exhibit. I would like to take this one step further. Rather than only focusing on the type of wickedness or the type of complexity, it is crucial to also consider the perceptual variation in a European Union with 28 member states. It is too often the case that particular forms of intervention tend to be routinely applied in a one-size-fits-all fashion to a variety of situations. Strategies might work under certain circumstances, but not in others. Complex problems are never the same. There are no general laws for complexity. And thus, each new problem requires a particular handling. And in a European Union that is prone to harmonization, this perhaps requires a turn to allowing more flexibility. As Bentley already stated before me, and I quote, "The challenge is to recreate public institutions and governance regimes as open and decentered systems which can thrive on diversity, adapt to radical innovation, and still maintain coherent purpose and progress." End of quote. Let's return to the example of a current policy problem the EU is struggling with, the refugee crisis. We indeed witness everything identified in this lecture. There is no agreement on the problem at hand. Different actors define and categorize the problem differently. In turn, this influences that there is no consensus on potential solutions. Those framing the refugee crisis as a terrorist problem are bound to identify different solutions compared to those framing it along the lines of economic migration. There is no complete knowledge about the state of affairs. No expert can claim with certainty if or when the crisis in Syria will be solved, how this will impact migration streams, what type of people will flee to Europe, and what impacts this will have on the domestic situations in various parts of the European Union. What we currently often witness, and the refugee crisis is no exception to this rule, is inertia. The EU is often not capable to respond to complex policy problems. What I have tried to show today is that we need to let go of the idea that complex policy problems can be solved uniformly in all 28 member states of the European Union. As Parsons stated, we need to accept diversity, embrace the possibility of failure, and recognize the importance of context. My claim is thus that we need to allow for more flexibility, more enhanced cooperation, and more self-organization within the EU. This goes directly against the words of Dutch Prime Minister Rutte, who stated a couple of weeks ago with the start of the Dutch presidency, and I quote, "A discussion on a Europe of many speeds or one speed or whatever is less important than getting to grips with border security and refugee burden sharing." End of quote. I claim that this discussion is important. We need to think about what can be regulated at the European level, not only in terms of subsidiarity, but also in terms of feasibility. I thus claim that the EU should be less afraid to allow differential, more tailored approaches that more directly speak to the variation in an international organization with 28 members. This is difficult. It will also most likely not be politically acceptable for many member states to not always know beforehand what action will be taken, in what specific situation. And it will perhaps also not be realistic, as we learn from bounded rationality that people have great difficulties in working with uncertainty. But the EU can only speak to complex policy problems by turning to more complex solutions. And this is obviously a difficult message to sell to the public in times of increasing populism. It is this specific puzzle of regulating complexity that I intend to concentrate on in the upcoming years. After the perhaps depressing message that complex policy problems can never be solved, let's turn to a puzzle I can tackle. Who to thank during this special day? But perhaps this is also a complex problem, as there are always more people to thank than time allows me to do here. First of all, thank you all for being here with me today. It really means a lot to me. I would like to start with thanking Rijn and Sophie for helping me make this position available. Working at this faculty, where I also studied, has always been a great pleasure, and I'm very happy that I can continue here in this new position. It was not easy at the start, though. When I was coming here for my interview, I dare to say that I had the hardest selection committee ever. I entered the room to see all, of course all male, professors the faculty had at that time sitting at the table. But I made it. Also thanks to the flexibility of my PhD supervisor, Frans van Waarden, who believed that I would be able to manage finishing my PhD in Utrecht, while at the same time starting working in Maastricht already. Thanks again, Frans, I really appreciated that. There are many colleagues that I would like to thank. Of course, I would like to start with Tanneli and Arnold. Tanneli, while everybody warned me against you as a supervisor for my thesis because you were considered to be scary and strict, I am still happy I did not listen to them. Thanks to you, I am here today, and I'm really grateful for everything you taught me over these last 20 years. Arnold, where are you? Thanks for introducing me to teaching and taking me on board in your first run of the Idea of Europe module, and thanks for always providing me with good tips for books to read. My working life at the faculty started with hours in the Pieter and the Take 5 and later the Poort with Pierre, Piotr, Patrick and Christine. Patrick, I am so happy that we became friends immediately in the early days, and it's great that we're in the same hallway now. It really makes my working days so much better. I would also like to take up this opportunity to apologize to Arjan for not always showing up on the Friday evening drinks. Every week I wonder whether I will be punished for my absence in the weekly email. I would also like to thank my ladies at the faculty. Marjolein, she could not be here, but I would like to thank her for being my first guide into the topic that I'm now interested in. Jessica, for keeping my feet on the ground and my stress levels relatively acceptable in times of reaccreditation crisis. Elisabetta and Annetta, for making my research so much more fun lately and for simply always being there for me. And a special thanks goes to Sophie and Christine. Sophie, thanks for always being there for me, for believing in me, and for simply being the best boss anybody can ever dream of. And Christine, what would life at Vasels be without you, huh? I cannot imagine. I cannot wait for more fun projects together, but most of all, more fun trips to exotic destinations, sharing a room and sharing how tough, but also how rewarding life as a working mom can be. A special thanks goes to my PhD students and fellow supervisors. I really learn a lot from the many discussions and joint publications, and can safely say that because of our cooperation, I now know much more about expertise in agencies, what makes implementation work, information processing, the regulation of chemical risks, and the rule of law. So thank you, Josien, Ginny, Christophe, Tessa, Hannah, Chris, Tanneli, Marjolein, and André. A special thanks goes to Tessa for additionally making my introduction into the managing of the Bachelor European Studies such a joy. I really learned from you not to take the always annoying brandjesblus stress too seriously. And then my friends, they are amazing. It is a miracle that they are still my friends after my horrible moments of complaints that I would never ever make it through my PhD. And when I did finish that damn thing, my complaining that it probably was rubbish and the committee probably didn't read it carefully enough. Then to the years doubting whether I could really manage academic life. Now to the years of the ongoing struggles of combining this academic life with a family. Without mentioning you, you know who you are. I do want to stress that I'm really happy and grateful for the countless afternoons and nights of drinking beer, wine, talking and joy, and I hope that many of more will follow. Let's start tonight, and let's hope that I last the party tonight a little bit longer than I did my PhD party. And Thomas and Anouk, no worries. This time there's no certificate to take home because I forgot it. Mama, wat is het jammer dat je er niet bij bent vandaag. Na de advertentie die je liet plaatsen in de plaatselijke krant toen ik mijn proefschrift afrondde, ben ik erg benieuwd wat je nu had gedaan. Ik ben blij dat je nog net hebt meegekregen dat dit moment zou komen. Mark, wat ben ik ontzettend blij met jou als broer. Ook al wonen we zo ver als maar kan uit elkaar in Nederland en doen we compleet ander werk. Die roots uit het zand zorgen voor een stevige gezamenlijke basis van humor, muziek, bier en Lowlands. En nog bedankt voor je aanbod dit ding wel even voor te lezen als ik dicht zou klappen. Bar en Colette, lieve vriendinnetjes. We gaan al 28 en 23 jaar samen door het leven. En ik ben nog steeds ontzettend dankbaar voor deze fijne vriendschappen. Jullie zijn fantastisch. Wim en Mies, veel dank voor het rotsvaste vertrouwen dat jullie mij altijd schenken en voor de onvoorwaardelijke liefde voor onze kindjes. Nora en Tijn, lieve schatten, ik hoop dat jullie je niet al te erg hebben verveeld. Geen zorgen, ik ben nu echt bijna klaar. Ik durf wel te zeggen dat ik hier kan staan dankzij jullie. Omdat het zo'n feest is om jullie in mijn leven te hebben, is de stress en hectiek van het werk thuis vaak snel vergeten. Nora en Tijn, ik hou van jullie. Jeroen, zonder jou had ik hier absoluut niet gestaan. 23 jaar geleden zagen we elkaar op het Orakelkamp aan het begin van mijn studententijd. En het gevoel van toen is nooit weggegaan. Jij stimuleert me te zijn wie ik ben en hebt me geleerd om op mezelf te vertrouwen. Het leven is een feestje met jou. Op naar de volgende 23 jaar vol onbeperkte mogelijkheden. Ik heb gezegd.
Dear Professor Versluis, dear Esther, congratulations with this inspiring and crystal clear inaugural lecture. Your reflections about the challenges of dealing with risks and uncertainties could not have come at a more timely moment. At today's special Brexit and Migration Summit, the heads of state and government in Brussels are not just trying to deal with one, but with many different complex crises and uncertainties. The different perceptions and fragmentation of authority problems you were referring to were unfortunately all too obvious. Esther, it is exactly 18 years ago since you first graduated at this university. Already in your master thesis, you showed an interest in public policy, and you were comparing policy styles in Belgium and the Netherlands. And then you moved on to Utrecht, where Frans van Waarden took care of you. You were exploring in Utrecht compliance and enforcement of EU directives, and you were doing a comparative studies of 4 countries there. During your time as a PhD candidate, some of your former professors in Maastricht, and especially Tannelie Blom, was still keeping an eye on you. And once we had concrete plans for a Bachelor European Studies, you were asked to apply for one of the vacancies. And as you told us, you were recruited after a very severe selection in 2003. During all the years that you were at the faculty, you have well managed to further develop your research profile, to further build on achievements in your research, and at the same time also you managed to play a central role in some of our programs, the Bachelor European Studies and before also the Master European Public Affairs. And at the same time at the home front, Jeroen and you were joined by Nora and Tijn. From a student, PhD candidate and junior colleague, you developed into a role model for many of your colleagues. Your openness, your critical attitude, your constructive spirit, your creativity as a researcher is highly appreciated. It is therefore not surprising that 2 years ago, the colleagues in Utrecht actually were exploring the possibility to lure you back into the Randstad. But with the help of Rijn, I was very happy that we managed to keep you in Maastricht, and also very grateful that you decided to choose for us. Dear Esther, the fact that so many colleagues have joined us here today says a lot. It's an expression of our gratitude for what you have done over the past few years, also especially in the framework of the Bachelor European Studies, and it's also a sign of confidence in your future achievements. May I invite all of you who have joined us today for a drink and a toast on Esther. Those who are afraid to get lost should just follow the red gowns.